JD was born in Jackson, Kentucky, where he lived until he was 12. He calls Jackson his home and says his fondest memories are of life there. When he was 12, JD moved with his mom and older sister Lindsay to Middletown, Ohio, where most of his story takes place. JD's mother and father were married briefly but divorced when JD was under a year old, at which point his father basically dropped out of his life. When JD was 6 years old, his father legally gave up parental rights and allowed JD's mother's new husband to formally adopt JD. JD talks extensively about his family's past, specifically his grandparents, whom he calls Mama and Papa. Like JD, they were born in Jackson, Kentucky and moved to Middletown, Ohio when they were young, having married at the ages of 14 and 17. JD speaks very fondly of his Mama, but admits that her demeanor and choice of words were not for everybody. She was crude and never afraid to tell anyone how she was feeling. JD notes that she and her family struggled through poverty their whole lives. This is an aerial view of Jackson, Kentucky. As you can see, it's a fairly small and mainly rural town surrounded by the Appalachian Mountains. JD describes life in Jackson as shown here and says, quote, "Most of the people live in the mountains surrounding Kentucky Highway 15, in trailer parks, government-subsidized housing, in small farmhouses, and in mountain homesteads like the one that served as the backdrop for the fondest memories of my childhood," end quote. This is an aerial view of Middletown, Ohio. As you can see, in comparison to Jackson, Kentucky, Middletown is much larger and more populated and is mainly suburban. In describing Middletown, JD says, quote, "Today, downtown Middletown is little more than a relic of American industrial glory. Few businesses are doing well and many have ceased operating altogether," end quote. Most neighborhoods in Middletown are home to houses such as this one. In contrast to Jackson, Kentucky, however, Middletown is also home to more wealthy families. JD's biological father is absent for most of his childhood, but does come into the picture when JD is 12 and JD lives with him briefly. His mother marries and divorces several times, leaving JD with a sense that no one sticks around permanently. This also means JD had many step-siblings come and go. JD's mother develops an addiction to narcotics and often uses her son as a way to stay out of trouble. In one instance, she forces him to provide a urine sample so she can pass a drug screening. JD is very close with his grandparents, especially his Mama. He ends up living with her off and on after his Papa dies. This gives JD a sense of guilt because he is being supported by his aging grandmother. JD speaks much more at length about his post-secondary education than he does about middle or high school. He does say that in general his grades were poor and he missed classes regularly. Since his mother was dealing with her addiction, she was often not home to make sure JD was making it to school each day. If I were JD's teacher, I would promote self-efficacy and deep learning by listening intently to JD and encouraging him to talk to me in an effort to build a strong relationship where he feels safe. This is especially important given the fact that he lacks meaningful relationships with most of the adults in his life. I would praise school success and never what he owns or doesn't. I would take time to understand why he defaults to certain behaviors, like his physical nature, and explain why behavior like that is not acceptable in a school setting. This would be especially tricky to navigate because JD's Mama instilled in him the importance of defending one's honor. She once went so far as to punch him in the face to teach him how to fight. I would support self-efficacy and deep learning by making clear that I am a partner in the learning process and that I am there to guide students, not to be their superior. Ellen Brantlinger notes that students, especially those living in poverty, may see teachers as members of a higher class. It is my job to make sure students know I am not above them. I would be an aid in breaking the cycle of poverty. As a student that Brantlinger references felt that there was no way out of the cycle of poverty or out of his hometown, which is similar to JD's story. Even when he finally decided he did want to go to college, the long and confusing paperwork changed his mind. As his teacher, I would offer to help him with the paperwork or at the very least put him in touch with someone qualified to do so and offer to go with him for support. I would promote self-efficacy and deep learning by using strategies from teaching tolerance, including understanding that respect is subjective. Teaching tolerance tells us that teachers and students may have differing definitions and expectations of respect. This relates to JD's experience because of the lack of respect shown in his household. His mother and her numerous husbands were constantly fighting, and JD notes that because of this, he began to think that this is just how people treated one another. So in this case, it would be crucial to have a conversation with JD and the rest of the class about what respect means to them. I would be a warm demander. I would build strong relationships by greeting students at the door, interacting with them outside of class, listening intently to them, modeling humility and fallibility, and involving parents or guardians, not just when students are doing poorly or misbehaving.